Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the fourth session of our Manasota Asala Summer Lecture Series on the Reconstruction. Very happy to see all of you again and launch into our ongoing project. A couple of reminders. We will meet next Saturday, the 4th of July. You recall, certainly those of you who've been in the class for at least 3 sessions, we did a poll, and the majority determined that with the stay-at-home orders, we weren't going to be out barbecuing anyway, so we will conduct our class as scheduled on Saturday, the 4th. A reminder as well that on the 11th of July, we have a special guest, Michael Moore, who is the great-great-grandson of Robert Smalls, one of the Reconstruction Black legislators we're going to study on the 4th and on the 11th. And also Dr. Morgan's special presentation on the 1st of August, which I'll hit at the end here, but just a reminder so you can extend your calendars and stay with us for 9 Saturdays as opposed to the designed 8. Okay, quick summary. We spent a lot of time last week on the Freedmen's Bureau. I am a fan of the Freedmen's Bureau, and therefore I think that history has treated them badly, and I want us to correct that, because I think that, again, they saved an enormous number of lives, poor black and poor white, and put the South on as good a footing as could happen given the terrible 5 years of war. The ambiguities of free labor, the challenges of rebuilding a destroyed society that had for generations depended upon free enslaved labor, now imposing or trying to create a new labor system based on contracts. That was obviously the desire of the planters, desires of those in control of Reconstruction, both presidential and the radical Reconstruction, which we will look at today. The difficulty for the enslaved persons, again, was not wanting to be tied to former enslavers. That is logical to all of us, and so that tension would create great difficulties all throughout this period. A lot of time spent last week on Andrew Johnson and the political battles fought between himself and the Republicans. We'll touch on the radical Republicans specifically today and how they will take over Reconstruction from Johnson because of his contentious attitude, his unwillingness to work with the Republicans, and his rabid racism. The North, we concluded by saying their hope had been that the South would have realized the tragedy of allowing themselves to be led into this war by wealthy planters, and the hope that the North had was that the rest of Southern society, white Southern society, would not allow these same oligarchs, the enslavers, the planters, to reassume control of the South. And that's exactly what happened under Johnson's leadership, as he put these many former Confederates back into positions of power during presidential Reconstruction. Couple of questions. Someone asked, one of our classmates asked a very good question. You recall our discussion of General Sherman and Defense Secretary Stanton's meeting in Savannah with a group of both free and freed black men. And the question asked of me was simply asking for land and autonomy enough? Should they have been asking for more? I did find an interesting piece in our Facing History and Ourselves about that meeting. So let me just share with you the questions actually that Sherman put to this group and their responses. The Black community chose Garrison Frazier, a minister who was formerly in to represent their views before Sherman and Stanton. What follows is an excerpt from the transcript of this meeting known as the Savannah Colloquy. Question 1, state what your understanding is. This is Sherman to Pastor Frazier, Garrison Frazier. State what your understanding is in regard to the acts of Congress and President Lincoln's proclamation touching the condition of the colored people in the rebel states. Frazier answers, so far as I understand President Lincoln's proclamation to the rebellious states, it is that if they would lay down their arms and submit to the laws of the United States before the 1st of January, 1863, all should be well. But if they did not, then all the slaves in the rebel states should be free, henceforth and forever. That is what I understood. It's interesting that Sherman is posing this question. There was ever the question in the minds of whites North and South. What did enslaved people, what did freed Black people think? What was their understanding? So he starts the meeting in this way. Second question, state what you understand by slavery and the freedom that was to be given by the president's proclamation. The answer, slavery is receiving by irresistible power the work of another man and not by his consent. The freedom, as I understand it, promised by the proclamation is taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we could reap the fruit of our own labor and take care of ourselves and assist the government in maintaining our freedom. The third question, Sherman to Garrison Frazier and the group, state in what manner you think you can take care of yourselves and how can you best assist the government in maintaining your freedom? Frazier's answer, the way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and to turn it and till it by our labor. That is by the labor of the women and children and old men. And we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. Sherman's fourth question, state in what manner you would rather live, whether scattered among the whites or in colonies by yourselves. Frazier's answer, I would prefer to live by ourselves, for there is a prejudice against us in the South that will take years to get over, but I do not know that I can answer for my brethren. Parenthetical here, Mr. Lynch says he thinks they should not be separated but live together. One of the participants in the meeting, all of the other persons present being questioned one by one answered that they agreed with Brother Frazier. Last question, do you think that there is intelligence enough among the slaves of the South to maintain themselves under the government of the United States and the equal protection of its laws and maintain good and peaceable relations among yourselves and with your neighbors? Frazier's answer, I think there is sufficient intelligence among us to do so. So I found that an interesting, a lengthy answer to the question that was asked me, but an opportunity to paint a picture of that meeting. I'm always struck by the image that we saw last week of Sherman and Stanton in that beautiful meeting room. But this provides, again, some, I think, some real color to it. The last question, and more a follow-up, last week, I think Jim Stewart mentioned that there was a U.S. Supreme Court case that relied on the Civil Rights Act of 1866. We covered that. We'll cover it some more today. And I just wanted to point out that, as always, Jim is on top of it. It's a case I remembered from law school, and I would not at that time have associated that discussion with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but it was actually a housing case. A Black man wanted to buy a house, he was denied. The case went to the district court, the courts of appeals, and they said the Civil Rights Act of 1866 did not reach individual discrimination. Supreme Court reversed and said it does indeed. So this act is enormously significant. I think we said last week the Civil Rights Act of 1866 would introduce birthright citizenship into law that's going to become codified in the 14th Amendment. And federal power that had not before existed. And we'll talk some today about how these 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments really reshapes the relationship between the federal government and certainly the state and the local. And this Civil Rights Bill of 1866 is sort of the first step off that in that direction. Interestingly, the act was modeled after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. If you were in my class, my slavery class, or if you, and most of you are informed about this part of our history, the Fugitive Slave Act, a part of the Compromise of 1850, may have been one of the last straws, if you will, leading up to the Civil War and secession. But in the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, where the federal government essentially deputized all citizens to assist in recapturing runaway enslaved people, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 had that same sort of exertion of federal power in defense of the rights of freed and free people of color. I think we said last week, Johnson will veto this bill March 27th, 1866. Congress would override it, and Fonner made the point, I believe, in the video, that it's the first instance of the Congress overriding a major piece of legislation. So a significant piece of legislation that comes virtually months after the end of the Civil War. Okay, I want to, hopefully you all know Henry Louis Gates. We've talked about Gates's Stony the Road. I've used references, we'll use them throughout. Beyond Gates's Reconstruction work, I hope you're familiar with his broad range of scholarship in the area of African American history. I believe he's still on the faculty at Harvard. I'd have to look back and see Life Upon These Shores, the African Americans, looking at my own library of Gates's work. He's written obviously history, he's written articles, and he's done some phenomenal video work. He's converted much of his scholarship into these PBS-based videos. The one on slavery, Life Upon These Shores, is phenomenal. And so this Reconstruction, America after the Civil War, I struggled to work it into my Reconstruction class for Ollie, given sort of the time constraints. But I have a passage here on June 27th where I don't have any other video. So I'm taking bits and pieces to help us tell the story. Again, I commend you to PBS and this I think 4-part, 8-hour segment. We're obviously going to use bits and pieces of that today. So let me play some of that right now, hopefully.
On the evening of June 17, 2015, a stranger walked into an historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina, known as Mother Mary. He prayed with the Wednesday night Bible study group for almost an hour. Then, he opened fire.
I do believe this was a hate crime.
Friends say the 21-year-old high school dropout was a loner, an unabashed racist with a deep hatred for black people.
He just said, I have to do it. He said, you rape our women and you taking over our country.
The massacre in Charleston touched off not only a debate over the Confederate flag, but it touched off a debate all over the country. How did we get here? And why is this happening?
It was easy, I guess, to think of that as a singular horror. And it was convenient, I think, to think of it that way. Unless you really wanted to understand how this could happen And then that meant that you had to get into the history.
Most of us know that our country fought a civil war in the 1860s, but less is known about what came afterward, the chaotic, exhilarating, and ultimately devastating period known as Reconstruction. If we're looking for the roots of the tragedy at Mother Emanuel, this is where we have to start.
The Reconstruction period is one of extraordinary excitement, a time when America could finally become that land of freedom that it had promised to be since the very beginning.
Black people actually sat in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Poor whites and black people saw a common cause with one another.
You're seeing this opportunity and imagining that will only get better. And looking back, what we know is those black folks had no idea of the cliff that they were heading towards.
The achievements of Reconstruction triggered a fearsome backlash, an onslaught of terror and oppression that lasted for decades.
After 250 years of slavery, white Southerners could not quite accept the 4 million former slaves as equal members of their society.
Violence is used in conjunction with Jim Crow in order to strip African Americans of the rights and privileges they gained during Reconstruction. The Charleston Massacre comes from a long history of white terror against African Americans.
But Reconstruction left a legacy of hope, as well as violence.
We have to recognize the injustices that were inflicted, but we can't reduce all history to that injustice. People who had been held in perpetual bondage confronted the greatest sin of American history straight on.
Their hopes were far greater than maybe what any government can accomplish. A system functioning without race being a barrier to equality, we still haven't quite gotten there.
Almost a century and a half later, we still find ourselves haunted by the collapse of Reconstruction, a chapter of our history that's often been misrepresented and misunderstood. It's time that we acknowledge the true story and complete the work of reconstructing America.
This is obviously Gates's opener, and it's an excellent one. It includes obviously some historians that we know we've seen in the Facing History and Ourselves series. I love Jelani Cobb's perspective. Some look at the Mother Emanuel AME massacre as a singular horror. If you want, as he says, to really understand, you've got to get into the history. And I think that's what we're endeavoring to do here. The other comment, I think it might have been Foner's, the 250 years of slavery followed by Reconstruction, and the realization that whites simply could not accept blacks as equals. So I go back then to the mindset of the Northerners who had won the war, who were assuming that white Southerners would not again allow the planters who had led them into this disastrous war to lead them again. And that was an assumption that was wrong, and that error in thinking by the Northerners would lead ultimately to the destruction of Reconstruction and this effort to rebuild society, and then to another 150 years of Jim Crow and racial terror, which we'll get into more here. So the Gates, we'll see more of Gates here today, but I want to take a bit of a diversion, take us back to our Slate Academy podcast and talk about two characters who, and this comes again, if you recall, the Slate podcast is built around what they call experiments. So these are experiments in democracy. In this particular case, they're looking at experiments in local governments. When we talk about Black politicians in the Reconstruction, we talk about people like Robert Smalls, and we think about those who go on to the US Congress and the governorships in Louisiana and to the US Senate. there are 2,000 or more free and freed people of color who will assume office, elective office during this period. And so I thought it would be a good way to begin that discussion, which we will do over the next 2 weeks as well, by talking about this political reality on the ground at the local level. Let me begin with Charles and Albert Morgan. One of the students this morning asked about white Northerners coming south to assist in Reconstruction and rebuilding the nation. Charles and Albert Morgan were two white Northeasterners from abolitionist families. Morgan will both fight in the Civil War for the North. Morgan will be wounded at a can't remember the battle, but in any event, he survives. After the war, he and his brother move to Mississippi, believing that they can build a new life, that there is lots of land available, land at a very good price, and B, there's opportunities for people with ambition, with some skills. And so they create a new life in Mississippi. Morgan will actually be elected sheriff of Yazoo County, I believe is the correct county. And what they do that creates conflict with their white planter neighbors is to treat the people of color working for them better than they've been treated by any of the, obviously the enslavers, but by any of the other planters. Everyone, again, trying to recreate this agrarian, this agricultural force that the South was. So Morgan and his brother buy a small plantation. They begin to succeed after 1 or 2 years. The local officials, white officials, and the planter neighbors essentially create this conspiracy. They take this property back from Morgan, and he doesn't leave. He's committed to stay. And he ultimately, because of his relationship with blacks, both free and freed in and around the community, he gets elected sheriff. Perhaps the most important elective office on the local level. And he has the full support of the black community. He has the ire of the white community, and he's now forced off his land. He and his brother are living in rented rooms in the main city, and have armed themselves because they're essentially now being targeted by the planters and the whites who disagree with the way he was trying to create a new labor model, and B, he has this very close association with the black community. At this point, the black community is 75% of the population in this part of Mississippi. So Morgan is hemmed in. He and his followers he's trying to execute his office as sheriff, always looking over his shoulders, worried at any minute that he's going to be assassinated. 1 or 2 of his black associates are in fact assassinated over this period of time. And so Morgan is, again, preparing to leave the area. The other interesting thing about the Morgan story, and I think he would be considered a carpetbagger. Again, carpetbaggers were northern whites typically who would come to the South, always for opportunity, not always for the best motive, but also, like Morgan, willing to invest in the community, willing to work with anybody willing to work with them. But that was anathema, again, to the Southern white establishment, and he was targeted. The other thing that Morgan would do to bring additional anger against him. He marries a free black woman who had come from the North, was a school teacher. They marry, they have children. So obviously I'm telescoping a lot of time here, but I just want to introduce these characters because what they represent are the reality that there were efforts being made to create a new society in the South, and B, how perilous those efforts were. So on top of disrupting the model that these white Southerners had thrived under, he would go so far as to actually marry a black woman and still live in that community. So he violated about every social code that the South had survived under for so long, being in ultimate control of their black population and having dominance over black women and exerting their sexual power as enslavers and continuing to do so even after slavery. So Morgan is ultimately run out of Mississippi. He and his family escape one night after they realize that there is armed men looking for them. They escape north, and he then spends the rest of his life in and around Washington, D.C. with his family, lobbying on behalf of Black people in the South, trying to regain some of what he had lost. He never does so successfully, tries to publish his memoir, has to self-publish, and ultimately dies destitute. So somewhat of a tragic story, but a story that, again, I think answers the question about the motives, if you will, of so-called carpetbaggers, and again, the perilous nature of that kind of intention on the part of a Northerner coming to the South. Let me also introduce Tunis Campbell to you. So this is Reverend G.T. Campbell, born a free black man in Middlebrook, New Jersey, 1812. He is trained as a missionary at an all-white Episcopal church in Babylon, New York, and was initially employed by the American Colonization Society. I think we've talked about colonization before. You remember Lincoln's belief that colonization would be a good thing for blacks that expatriate back to Africa because we'll never be able to live together. This was Campbell's original mindset until he realizes in working with these colonizationists, many of whom were also abolitionists, that if in fact colonization succeeded, all of the free and freed black people are shipped to Africa, that would only leave the enslaved people with no one to defend them. So he makes a commitment. He says in his memoir, never to leave the shores of the United States until every black person is free. And he spends the rest of his life pursuing that pledge. He becomes an AME Zion minister, an anti-colonization and abolitionist lecturer, traveled occasionally with Frederick Douglass. He's married. He and his wife Harriet have 3 children, and he spends much of his life trying to better build churches, build communities, institutions in the black communities in the North, until about 1863, he decides he's going to go south, and he secures a commission from the Secretary of War to help resettle black refugees in Port Royal, South Carolina. We've talked about the Sea Islands off of Georgia and South Carolina. This is where he's sent. He becomes a supervisor of land claims in 1865 and begins to build a community. He is obviously a free person, educated person, a minister, dedicated to his people. And he's now in the thick of this almost the end of the war and trying to create, again, community for Black people. He and a group of the other freedmen purchased 1,250 acres. They form an association. They parcel out the land. They're sharing profits. He's built a community. And in fact, on St. Catherine's Island, they have a community of 400 formerly enslaved people and a militia of 300 strong armed Black men defending against attacks from the Ku Klux Klan at this point. So he is perhaps the best known Black man in this part of Georgia and South Carolina at the time. By 1872, he is elected to the convention that will determine the new legislature. He ultimately is elected to the Georgia State legislature. I said 1872, I should have said 1868. And he is denied seating in the Georgia legislature. Again, this would have been the remnants of the government that Johnson established. So it was probably more around 1880, 1866. And he goes to Washington to petition that he should be seated and that the white delegates from the convention and those elected should not be seated. And the Republican Congress recognizes Campbell's legitimacy and those of the other Black legislatures and deny the seating in Georgia of the white legislatures. So imagine you're in a completely new world where the federal government has never had power over local or state politics. And in this era, you see Tunis Campbell and his Black colleagues asserting power supported by the federal government. And he does, in fact, take his seat in the Georgia legislature. He returns to Georgia after his appeals in Washington, and he's attacked. He's charged with a crime by a white Democratic prosecutor and a judge. He's tried, he's convicted, and he's sentenced to jail on truly trumped up charges. He was an advocate for sailors in this particular instance who were on ships off the shore, and he was lobbying on their behalf and angered the ship owners. So he goes to jail for almost 5 years. He spends most of that time obviously defending himself in jail, but also working with his lawyer who's based in Atlanta, trying to get himself free. They appeal to the federal government. He does ultimately get released, but by the time of his release, he returns home. His business and his home have been burned down, and he and his family have to flee for their lives. He, like Morgan, will go to Washington, D.C., write his memoir. And again, both of these white carpetbagger, Black activist minister just tell us how courageous, first of all, you would have to be to face the sort of opposition that you would in doing what they were trying to do, and the great risk and the peril that you and your family would suffer, deigning to believe you could make a difference in this community. So those are two of my stories from Slate Academy. Let's now make a jump to the radical Reconstruction, the radical Republicans who have convened the 39th Congress. Johnson has done his damnedest to create mirror racist governments in the South, just as existed before the war. And Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner will have none of it. And we'll see some of that in this segment from Gates's film. I've got to advance it a bit here, so give me a moment. I practiced this all yesterday and got pretty good at it.
Thaddeus Stevens, a passionately impatient Republican congressman, had been forced to wait on the sidelines for months, watching powerlessly as Andrew Johnson raced to implement his version of Reconstruction before Congress reconvened. The president declared that the former Confederate states had met his terms, so their representatives were in Washington, ready to take their seats in Congress as members of the Union once again. Stevens thought this was outrageous.
When the states met to elect new congressional delegations, they elected to Congress the Vice President of the Confederacy, 4 Confederate generals, 6 members of the Confederate cabinet, many Confederate congressmen.
It is, by its very nature, defiant for Southern white former Confederate officers to head to Congress right after the war. On the other hand, they never believed the war was about fundamentally restructuring their economic and political hierarchy. The idea that if you served or if you had slaves at one point, that now you are politically disenfranchised never was in the kind of Southern white imagination during that period of time.
Once the Southern delegates were seated in Congress, they'd represent their home states back in the Union again.
Either they were going to be admitted, and that was going to be the end, and Reconstruction would have been over at that point, or they weren't.
As a leader of the House Republicans, Stevens found the prospect appalling.
Thaddeus Stevens would say, African American men helped save the United States. We have a moral obligation to create a foundation of freedom and equality before the law. And without that, anything else is going to be a fraud. He was fired with this passion for justice that would saturate the entire social order. He was ready for a revolution in the South.
Stevens and his fellow House Republicans had planned for this moment. At the stroke of noon, when the 39th Congress opened, they set those plans in motion.
The clerk began to read the roll of the members of Congress, and he skipped over the representatives from the southern states.
As it becomes clear that they're not going to call upon any rebel state congressman, Democrats start to jump up and scream, "This is revolution." In fact, they were right. It was a revolution.
Each House of Congress has the power to exclude those it finds unfit. If the clerk fails to call your name, you're not a member of Congress. Not a single name from the rebel states did the clerk call that day. Congress was boldly seizing control of Reconstruction.
Some Democrats say the American Republic died on December 4th, 1865, and in some ways they might be right. But a second American Republic is born over the next 5 years that has a different constitution, one that's going to be written painfully and slowly and imperfectly, but written by Stevens and his colleagues in Congress.
This Republican-dominated Congress turned its attention to a pioneering Civil Rights Act, which they passed over President Johnson's veto in April 1866.
It was Congress's answer, you might say, to the Black Codes and to Johnson's Reconstruction Plan. It established the principle of birthright citizenship. Anyone born in the country is a citizen.
Why do they do this? Because they know that Southern states are looking for ways to define ex-slaves as not citizens.
Part of what the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is doing is pushing away the prospect that people can be, as had been true for Native Americans, that people can be physically removed from the nation.
While Republicans were gaining the upper hand in Washington, a more brutal struggle was being waged throughout the South.
The White South begins to realize that there's no real possibility of fighting the North, but they can win the struggle on the ground, at home, over the people that they're really worried about.
So let me stop there. We'll come back to more, but consider for a moment the statement that the Southerners never believed the war was about fundamentally altering their way of life. Imagine having started this war, fought this war, lost this war, and yet retaining the arrogance and the confidence that I can come back, I can sit in the US Senate as though nothing had happened, and we'll go on with life. It's astounding to me, as it was to Thaddeus Stevens and Sumner and the radical Republicans. And imagine their reaction when their names are not called by the clerk. It's one of those pictures. It's one of those events you'd love to have been a fly on the wall. It's just a remarkable, remarkable moment. And there's so many remarkable moments in this era. And I never cease to imagine what would America be today if, in fact, Stevens's revolution had been allowed to play out, had the federal government been committed to true equality, both economic and political and social, and prepared to defend that into the future to change society. They weren't, obviously, and we'll see the roots of that. And we live with the roots of that today. And let me move on here. So let's talk about the radical Republican ideology and Stevens and Sumner. They had this utopian vision of a nation whose citizens enjoyed equality across the board. And Stevens and Sumner are obviously the key proponents. Let me read a bit about what was said of them in description. And you remember again that four-cellar meeting between Stevens and Sumner. And I don't think I'll ever get Tommy Lee Jones's comment about his face. It is a remarkable face, and the statements he made about his feelings for people. The preeminent radical leaders, Stevens and Sumner, differed in personality and political style. The recognized floor leader of House Republicans, Stevens was a master of congressional infighting, parliamentary tactics, and blunt speaking. One contemporary called him a perfect political brigand, a rude jouster in political and personal warfare, and his quick tongue and sarcastic wit were legendary. When it was first proposed to free the slaves and arm the blacks, he remarked in 1865, did not the nation tremble? The prim conservatives, the snobs, the male waiting maids in Congress were in hysterics, Stevens said. Even those who disagreed with his policies could not avoid a grudging admiration for the man and his honesty, idealism, and indifference to praise and criticism, qualities not altogether common among politicians. 73 years old, 65, Stevens impressed Clemenceau, the French statesman and French prime minister, as the Robespierre of the Second American Revolution. Yet Stevens knew, too, the limits of his influence. No man was oftener outvoted, a Boston newspaper commented after his death, and Stevens proved more than willing to seize immediate political advantages and to compromise when necessary. Like Stevens, Sumner was a man absolutely convinced, and in a sense, rightly, that he and history were, for the moment, in perfect step. Disliked by Senate colleagues for egotism, self-righteousness, and stubborn refusal to compromise, Sumner acted as though he were the voice and the embodiment of the New England conscience, and in a sense he was. Unconcerned with the details of committee work and legislative maneuvering, Sumner's forte lay in lengthy, erudite speeches in which he expounded the recurrent theme of his political career, the principle of equality before the law. His speeches rarely had much impact on the details of legislation, but in the crisis of war and Reconstruction, Sumner's ideas acquired an increasing following in Republican circles. Sumner's uncompromising stance on black rights, a Californian wrote in 1866, had caused many Republicans to reassess their own opinions. You have hundreds of believers in your doctrine in this state where you had not one 4 years ago. Unlike Stevens, who never enjoyed close connections with moral reform circles, Sumner corresponded frequently with abolitionists who considered him their politician. So too did ordinary blacks, North and South, who deluged him with requests for advice and accounts of their grievances. Your name, wrote a Black Army veteran in 1869, shall live in our hearts forever. Let's stop here and take, if there are questions, Linda, Lois, or Marion, let me know. Let me remind you as they look at those, Charles Sumner was the congressman, the senator who was caned by Preston Brooks, I believe in 1858, on the floor of the Senate, almost to death, after having made what Preston Brooks thought was a slanderous abolitionist diatribe targeting a member of his family. And obviously Sumner, and fortunately Sumner, survived that attack. Do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. One question is, how did the Northern version of history, how did the Southern version of history supersede that of the Northern version of history?
How did the Southern version of history? Mary,
I'm sorry. Let me
Lois'
read the
hand.
question. How did the Southern historian's version of history come to dominate the narrative? Northern acquiescence or indifference?
So you're referring to the historians that would ultimately support the lost cause narrative, the Dunning School.
Yes.
And we'll look at this more closely as we look at the end of Reconstruction, but Dunning, who was the sort of lead historian, was a Southerner, as were his adherents. He had a number of scholars who studied under him, all of whom, many of whom worked at Columbia University. And so as the era moved into Jim Crow, as the lost cause narrative was reinforced in every aspect of public life, from the images and the literature, it essentially becomes a part of really the only history that was being told. Gates probably tells this better than anyone else in Stony the Road, because he spends most of the time talking about how this narrative is built by the newspapers, by the media, ultimately by Birth of a Nation. Dunning and his adherents simply pick up this theme and create again this story about the valiant South and the efforts to save white civilization from the marauding, barbaric Black politicians in Reconstruction. And that story is our story until historians like W.E.B. Du Bois in 1935 in his Black Reconstruction challenge that school of thought. And it won't be until Kenneth Stamp, I'm trying to think of his book, followed by Fauner, followed by other historians who correct that narrative and tell the truth about Reconstruction. So that's a long way of saying the South got out first, and they pressed very hard to be sure to create this new narrative of the noble lost cause and the victimized South glorified by, again, Gone with the Wind, Birth of a Nation.
Another comment. Question, is it true that the Black press tried to tell a more accurate story, but they often faced destruction of their businesses and lives for telling the truth?
Absolutely, and we will look at a specific example of that in North Carolina. There is, so this would be late in the period, so in the 1880s and 90s, Wilmington, and the newspaper editor in Wilmington is a obviously strong proponent of Black rights, Black freedoms, and his paper is targeted. He escapes with his life. His paper is burned down, and the Redeemer government, the Democrats, will forcibly take over Wilmington in a race riot. They will kill off or run off all of the Black office holders. It's referred to as the Wilmington coup d'etat. One example, Marion, of many examples of courageous Black editors and newspapers that risked their lives to tell the truth and lost their lives in more than one instance.
David, a technical issue.
Yes.
When you played the video, it appears that the audio during the video is too loud.
Okay.
And it's causing a echo feedback for some reason.
Okay.
I know this is brand new, so I'm suggesting that when you play the video, if you could turn down the audio.
I'll do that.
Computer.
Yeah. We've got one more. We've just one more, and I'll do that.
Okay.
All right.
And we have another question. Are there any monuments to Stevens and Sumner in the United States?
Great question. I do not know. There certainly ought to be. There certainly would not be any in the South. I don't know. That's it. We'll Google. Mr. Google can help us with that, but that's a great question. I don't know.
Okay. And then Stamp's book was The Peculiar Institution.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. Any more, Marion?
That's it.
All right. Then let's move on. I want to show another.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's one more recommendation that if you're not muting yourself during the videos, that might help. I'm not sure that'll work, but it's worth exploring.
I'll reduce my volume, and
okay.
I'm going to do that even now. Hopefully that won't affect much. I do want to play another little video clip here before we get into. I've said, and we've seen the horrendous anti-Black violence, the New York draft riots. We could spend the entire 8 weeks, and I don't want to do that, but you need to understand that all throughout this period, the war obviously is violence personified, but immediately after the war, there is a campaign of terror that is waged against the free and freed Black communities that will extend throughout Reconstruction, the post-Reconstruction, into Jim Crow, and to today with the police terror that we've been dealing with here recently. But let me just, I want to talk about these two incidences particularly, and I'll do the Memphis riot and try to play this video. Coach me, Marion, if it is. Let me first move to my spot.
On the ground, at home, over the people that they're really worried about.
It's good, David.
All throughout the South, Black people were on the move, leaving the countryside for the city. But as the crowding grew worse, tensions mounted.
Where do you live?
I've lived in Memphis very nearly 3 years.
How old are you?
I don't know exactly. I suppose about 24.
Were you here during the riots?
Yes, sir.
On the afternoon of May 1st, 1866, the streets of South Memphis were even busier than usual. The city was packed with freed people. Memphis had been garrisoned by a black regiment, and a Freedmen's Bureau office had opened there. Late that afternoon, Lucy Tibbs heard gunfire in the distance. The city's black garrison was being demobilized, and many of the former soldiers were celebrating in the streets. Memphis was seething with racial hostility, especially between the largely Irish police force and the black garrison.
African American Civil War veterans return, not only with a kind of bearing that comes from military service, many of them are going to come back with weapons that they have purchased from the Union. They're going to march through the streets of their cities, they're going to create militias, and they will meet white Southerners for whom this is a real overturning of the old order.
About 6 o'clock, I saw boys and men with pistols firing at every black man they could see. They shot them down as fast as they could come to them.
How many did you see shot down?
The first was killed by John Pendergrass. He keeps a grocery by my house. I was looking right at him when he shot that man.
One of the things that I think is frightening about the violence is that many people do know the people who are perpetuating this violence against them. They can name them.
White mobs, including most of the city's police force, began to roam the streets on the hunt for black people.
At night, they barred up all the doors, then surrounded the houses and told the folks to stay in there.
Is that what they told you?
Yes, sir. Old man Pendergrass and his sons set them on fire. When the fire got very hot, I saw men, women, and children break out and run. They shot at them as fast as they could while they were running.
The freed people are sort of beyond the law. And so there's an incredible amount of casual violence.
Did they come into your house?
Yes. I said, please don't do anything to me. I'm just here with 2 little children.
Did they do anything to you?
They done a very bad act. I just had to give up to them.
It took the Army 3 days to regain control of Memphis. By that time, every black church and every black school had been burned to the ground. At least 48 people had been killed, all but 2 of them black. Not a single white person had been killed by a black person. The nation was riveted by the news out of Memphis. Then 3 months later, almost 40 more people were killed by a white mob in New Orleans.
The testimony referred to is actually a congressional committee convened to examine the beginning and the motivations and the horror of this riot. And as the speaker said, the historian said they could name them. People knew, and they named those people in these hearings, and that record is preserved for today. The other thing to keep in mind is the reference to schools, churches, and businesses. In every one of these episodes, they will be targeted. And indeed, in all incidences of anti-Black violence, whether on this scale or smaller, you will see the attack against schools, churches, the institutions of burgeoning Black communities. So this is a Harper's Weekly artist depiction of that riot. Let's talk for a moment about the New Orleans race riot. New Orleans Massacre, also known as the New Orleans Race Riot, occurred on July 30th, 1866. While the riot was typical of numerous racial conflicts during Reconstruction, This incident had special significance. It galvanized national opposition to the moderate Reconstruction policies of Andrew Johnson and ushered in much more sweeping congressional Reconstruction in 1867. The riot took place outside the Mechanics Institute in New Orleans as black and white delegates attended the Louisiana Constitutional Convention. Remember, in the instance of Johnson's establishing governments, in the same case where the radical Republicans will establish governments, there are constitutional conventions held. Some multiracial, some not, but these then would be the springboards from which new governments would emerge and new legislatures would be elected. The convention had reconvened because the Louisiana state legislature had recently passed the Black Codes and refused to extend voting rights to black men. Also, on May 12, 1866, 4 years of Union Army-imposed martial law ended, and Mayor John T. Monroe, who had headed city government before the Civil War, was reinstated as acting mayor. Monroe had been an active supporter of the Confederacy. As a delegation of 100 black New Orleans residents followed behind the U.S. flag, marched behind the U.S. flag toward the Mechanics Institute, Mayor Monroe organized and led a mob of ex-Confederates, white supremacists, and members of the New Orleans police force to the Institute to block their way. The mayor claimed their intent was to put down any unrest that may come from the convention, but the real reason was to prevent the delegates from meeting. As the delegation came to within a couple of blocks of the Institute, shots were fired, but the group was allowed to proceed to the meeting hall. Once they reached the Institute, the police and white mob members attacked them, beating some of the marchers while others rushed into the building for safety. Now, the police and mob surrounded the Institute and opened fire on the building, shooting indiscriminately into the windows. Then the mob rushed into the building and began to fire into the crowd of delegates. When the mob ran out of ammunition, they were beaten back by the delegates. The mob left the building, regrouped, and returned, breaking down the doors and again firing on the mostly unarmed delegates. As the firing continued, some delegates attempted to flee or surrender. Some of those who surrendered, mostly black, were killed on the spot. Those who ran were chased as the killing spread over several blocks around the Institute. By this point, both the rioters and victims included people who were never at the Institute. African Americans were shot on the street or pulled off of streetcars to be summarily beaten or killed. By the end of the massacre, at least 300 black Union War veterans were killed, including 40 delegates to the convention. Another 230 people were killed and 46 were wounded. The riot's repercussions extended far beyond New Orleans. Northerners angry over the violence helped the Republican Party take control of the U.S. House and Senate in the congressional elections of 1866. That Republican-controlled series of measures that called for army occupation of 10 former Confederate states and measures that ensured voting rights for African Americans. Meanwhile, martial law was immediately reimposed in New Orleans after the riot, and Mayor Monroe and other city officials were forcibly removed from office for their part in the massacre. So you now have the radicals in control, and the focus for the first year is on this amendment to codify some of what the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 had legislated. Their objectives, obviously, to solve problems arising from the war, to establish principles regarding the rights of all people, black people, white people, and to deal, obviously, with the violence, recalcitrance of the white Southerners, those in control, or who wanted to be in control, to outline a way back into the Union for the seceded states. What would be required? Hopefully, something more than Johnson was requiring. To limit the political influence of the Confederates. They had demonstrated an unwillingness to compromise and an intention to return to a slaveocracy. Also to contribute to the nation building process catalyzed by the war, and to strengthen the political power of the Republicans going forward. Representation. you recall in the original Constitution, people of African descent were counted as 3/5 of persons. That would certainly be eliminated, but how was the basis to be determined? Representation, of course, was going to decide on the size of your congressional delegations, but other obviously very important issues like resources coming from the federal government based on the representation. And the most challenging perhaps was how to deal with the unrepentant, Confederate population in the South. Let's see if we can play a bit of this here. Got to get to my mark.
Going home and effectively being subject to continued violence, this time perhaps even death.
The testimony of the Memphis survivors helped to convince Republicans in Congress that the rights of the formerly enslaved had to be written into the Constitution itself.
This is what inflames white Northerners so much. The widespread violence against the freed people, the massacres in New Orleans and Memphis. So Reconstruction becomes stronger because of what the white South does.
Republicans in Washington were interested in setting the nation on a new footing, and that's what they did through the 14th Amendment.
The 14th Amendment redefined the rights of the freed people, and by extension, the rights of all Americans. Anyone born in the United States would automatically be granted citizenship, and no state could deny to any person due process and equal protection of the laws. Congress passed the 14th Amendment in June of 1866. It turns out that was the easy part. The real challenge lay ahead. Every southern state had an all-white government that had been created by President Johnson. And every one of those state legislatures, except for Tennessee, refused to ratify the amendment. How were Republicans in Washington going to get 3/4 of the states to ratify the 14th Amendment? The answer began to emerge almost a year later. By the spring of 1867, the radical Republicans were firmly in control. Every former state except Tennessee remained out of the Union, having no say in federal elections. The Northern-dominated electorate had given the Republicans huge congressional majorities in the 1866 midterms. The newly empowered majority lost no time in passing sweeping new laws over President Johnson's veto. Reconstruction entered a bold new phase.
In the spring of 1867, Congress turned from kind of the more moderate measures to saying, you know, we actually have to reorganize the South and set these states on a different course. And so the way that they do that is establishing the former Confederacy in 5 military districts. Each one is going to be overseen by a U.S. general. It was something that they called military reconstruction.
They marched through the South telling local officers, we can fire you, we can overrule you. Their goal is visibility, and their goal is to make a statement, you're not in charge, Confederates, we are.
Congress laid out strict new terms. The rebel states had to adopt new constitutions, give black men the right to vote, elect new state governments, and ratify the 14th Amendment. Then, and only then, could they be readmitted to Congress.
How would you get the southern states to adopt the 14th Amendment, to which they are deeply resistant? You say black men must be able to vote, and they also must be able to hold office. This, in the white Southern imagination, is the great travesty of Reconstruction. Some of the former Confederates who had been disenfranchised after the war still cannot vote, whereas black men can. So that is what just really infuriates the white South, and they call it bayonet rule.
When Southern whites imagined what could come after the war, should they lose, it was never a possibility of like a really flipped upside down social hierarchy with equality for African Americans, because that wasn't happening anywhere in the country.
Many northern states did not allow black men to vote. And so some white conservatives felt that the provision of suffrage to African American men in the South was something between hypocrisy and punishment.
Activists and army officers spread out across the South, registering free men to vote. At the beginning of 1867, fewer than 1% of all black men in the United States could vote. By the end of 1867, that figure was higher than 80%. A vibrant new political sprang up as freed men and freed women pressed for their rightful place in the Union that they had sacrificed so much to save.
The advent of black suffrage unleashes a kind of utopian idea of change. You see it in mass meetings where people get together just to read the Constitution and debate, what is democratic government anyway? How can we create it? So it is a remarkable moment of hope and of militancy.
Black men and women, these folks who had just come out of slavery, would take off work on Saturdays and walk 25 miles to a political meeting.
The vote was considered basically owned by the collective, not just by individuals. And so women and children were actually involved in political discussions. They attended mass meetings.
In some states, there were significant pockets of poorer white farmers who actually, many of them had not been in support of the Confederacy, had not favored secession, and many of them suffered as a result of the Civil War. They were in dire economic straits. It's not that they weren't racist anymore, but they were willing to work with blacks to try to uplift poor farmers of both races via the Republican Party.
Former slaves themselves are breathing life into freedom, giving it substance, whether it's creating schools or enacting their own political organizations or reconstituting families. They are giving the nation a kind of blueprint for the challenges, but also the possibilities of Reconstruction.
Andrew Johnson played almost no part in these profound changes, fending off impeachment consumed the last months of his presidency. Meanwhile, the new state governments in the South began ratifying the 14th Amendment. In July of 1868, it became the law of the land.
Ironically, if Reconstruction had gone more smoothly, you might not have had the 14th Amendment. If the white South had not insisted on putting exactly the same men back in power, if the white South had resisted the temptation to put in black codes that made a mockery of emancipation, if the white South had not endorsed these massacres in its major cities, it's easy to believe that there would not have been the fundamental changes in the American Constitution that we had.
Imagine that last thought. Had the white South not tried to recreate the slave society, we might not have had a 14th Amendment. Due process, equal protection, birthright citizenship, really a core principle of so much of American law today. And really a remarkable statement. Also, one of the other professors talked about the white Southern imagination, never believing that an outcome of this war would be their loss of the vote and black men being able to vote. It was just inconceivable where black men, women, and children, as another speaker talked about, would walk 25 miles after work to engage in these debates, to create a understanding of what was going on, what were the issues being debated in these conventions, and the convention members would be coming back to these meetings often to report. So it's a phenomenal time. In order to be reinstated, new constitutions had to be written, blacks had to be given the right to vote, new governments created, doing away with Johnson's racist governments, and to ratify the 14th Amendment. Truly, as important as the 15th Amendment will be, and we will see next week, truly a remarkable development in American law and in American society. I'm going to take just, Marion, do we have any? I've got a couple more slides, but I don't want to miss. Any questions coming out?
There isn't any specific questions. There's some comments about statues, and James Stewart states that there will be a statue of Thaddeus Stevens in Gettysburg in 2022, and there is a statue of Charles Sumner in Boston. And I had a question. Does it appear that after each step that we make progress or move forward toward freedom, has it always been accompanied by white violent backlash?
I'd say yes, Marion. The most recent example, of course, would be the Tea Party reaction to Barack Obama's election. Certainly the backlash after Reconstruction that will, again, lead to more violence. Backlash after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the 64, the Voting Rights Act 65. Indeed, you'll see some of the statutes that we're wrestling over today were erected shortly after the passage of the 20th century Civil Rights Act. So I think yes, and we could be more careful and document that, but I don't think there is an occasion in our history when Black people have risen up in some form, either in protest or through election, the acquisition of new rights through law, that's not been met with often violent, but certainly a reaction from those who would oppose Black people and their freedoms and the assertion of those freedoms. All right, let's move.
A new question. A new question: was the Rosewood Massacre related to Reconstruction, or was it separate? Was it a separate horrific murder and terrorism?
I believe Rosewood would have been later. I believe Rosewood, this is Rosewood, Florida, for those who you don't know. It's either associated with the 1919 Red Summer, or it may in fact be even later into the 30s and 40s. Again, we can certainly pinpoint that date, but another example of anti-Black violence precipitated by false accusations of some Black man assaulting some white woman, leading to the destruction of an entire community, like Tulsa and like the many others that we'll study and that you've heard about. Ocoee, Florida is another example that I think there was more in the 40s and the 50s, but we'll get that date. I'm sure somebody's Googling it as I speak. Anything else, Marion?
Some comments. Did Obama lead to Trump?
All right, let's leave the comments to the end. I think that's appropriate. But I'm gonna try to wrap up here and keep us close to our time.
All right.
Okay, so the 14th Amendment. Much of what we needed, we got from our video professors. 5 elements, sections to the amendment. The first, of course, would be establishing birthright citizenship, and the due process, equal protection, privileges and immunities. The section that's most known by all of us. Section 2 was essentially a penalty provision. representation would be reduced to the extent that there was evidence that a group or individual's rights were being denied. The third was supposed to bar from office Confederates, rebels, never really employed. And the section had a provision where Congress could pardon someone and they could serve and they could vote. 4 was a reference to the protection of the federal debt. And 5, more importantly, was the enabling language that, again, we saw in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, giving these constitutional amendments the power of the federal government. Interestingly, I think Fonner makes the point that if you contrast this Section 5 language with the language from the Bill of Rights, he says in the Bill of Rights, Congress shall make no law with the enforcement language of these Reconstruction Acts. Congress shall have the power, so you see this shift in the role of the federal government in enforcing the rights ultimately of individuals, but protecting those rights against an assault from individuals or the local government entities. Of course, Johnson repudiates or vetoes. Congress will ultimately override Johnson's veto. Johnson will go on a campaign for re-election, but ends up campaigning to redeem his reputation. He spends the summer. He isn't a candidate of the Republican Party. He forms the National Union Party. And I'll give you a snippet from one of his speeches in this campaign he launched. He's in Cleveland, and a member of the audience yells, "Hang Jeff Davis." And the president replied, "Why not hang Thad Stevens and Wendell Phillips?" Wendell Phillips is a well-known abolitionist and remains active all throughout this era in support of Black rights. Johnson also indulged in as Fonner would say, a unique blend of self-aggrandizement and self-pity. On one occasion, he intimated that Providence had removed Lincoln to elevate Johnson himself to the White House. At St. Louis, he blamed Congress for instigating the New Orleans riot and unleashing a muddled tirade against his opponents. He says, this is Johnson, "I have been traduced. I have been slandered. I have been maligned. I have been called Judas Iscariot. Who had been my Christ that I have played the Judas? Was it Thad Stevens?" he said. So clearly a grievance-filled president, one-term president at the end of that presidency. So we are approaching, as I say here, the coming of Black suffrage. 1866 elections, midterms, the Republicans, because of the violence that the North public opinion had turned dramatically in support of the radical Republicans, and they add to their majorities in both seats, and it marks the end of presidential Reconstruction, will mark the end of Johnson's presidency. You notice the reference in the video clip to the Tenure of Office Act. That's actually the act that will lead to his impeachment, not removal, but impeachment, when he, I believe it is, he fires either Stanton or one of the other cabinet members. January 1867, Congress enfranchises Blacks in Washington, D.C. and in the territories, and conditions the admission of Nebraska and Colorado on Black suffrage. So clearly Black suffrage, enfranchising Black men to vote, will become the focus of action over the next few years. Interestingly, the enslavers who lost their property in Washington received reparations. We can talk more about that. It's clear it is one instance, maybe the only instance, where America paid reparations, but they paid them to the wrong people, in my view. Okay, so next week we're going to look at this Reconstruction Act 1867. The South now divided into 5 military districts. The Union Army is back in the South. assisting in the registration of Black men, not women. This distinction that was clearly made in the 14th Amendment will lead to the split in the women's movement, and they will break from the abolitionist, and that's a story that we also need to understand and talk about. But Black men are the focus of this this new population of voters. And I think that takes us to about the end. A reminder of Dr. Morgan's session on August 1st, so please add that to your calendars. A session I think we're all going to look forward to. And that will conclude right at 12:30, if my clock is right, and we'll see if there are any other questions or comments, Marian.
Okay, so the first comment we want to make is that today is your birthday. And so therefore, we would like to celebrate your birthday. And
we're gonna stop the recording now, Mary.
Yes, I'll stop the recording.
And I'll stop sharing. Oh, here comes my